Summer's supposed to be the easy season. So why are so many people quietly Googling a therapist between summer Fridays? Because more daylight doesn't fix the hard stuff. Sometimes it just turns the volume up. Grow does therapy differently. Therapy is not only for when you're in crisis. Grow Therapy is here for all the moments when you decide you want more. More support, more clarity, more tools. Mental health isn't a destination you reach. It's something you build, and Grow makes that easier. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
This Monday.com ad was created by a team of people and AI agents. Reese, our content agent, wrote the copy based on our best practices, like mentioning Monday.com 3 times. That was the second. Johnny, our coordination agent, built the timeline and kept everyone aligned. Olivia, our human creative director, stayed in the loop. Because agents are great, but they don't always know when a joke lands. She had one note: tell listeners it only takes minutes to build an agent. So, minutes. Create your own AI agent today on Monday.com.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasting.
One day, Michael was a fun-loving 21-year-old who lived at home in a busy, loving family of 7. 2 weeks later, he was mostly alone in his parents' 4-bedroom house, with bloodstains in the basement, bullet holes in the kitchen, and a good-sized rectangle of missing carpet in the living room where his little brother Johnny fell. His family was in tatters. He said he was lonelier than he'd ever been. I had to grow up overnight. I miss my family so damn much. From Killer in the House by Kathryn Canavan. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. Today we are continuing the true crime book I'm featuring, The True Crime Thriller by Kathryn Canavan, episode 175, Let's Be Careful Out There. Part 2 of 4, on Killer in the House, 10 Days of Terror in a Pennsylvania Suburb, on one of the most sensational crimes of the 20th century. In Part 1, the stage was set for understanding the 1970s in Trevose, Pennsylvania, which is roughly a 30-minute drive from Philadelphia. We met the Abt family, Jack and Peggy, parents of 5 children, Clifford, Michael, Margie, Johnny, and Kathy, and Gary Engle, the boyfriend of Margie, with 6 of them slaughtered at one time, where a killer had laid in wait, shooting them one by one as they came home on March 12, 1976. These multiple homicides shocked and devastated the community, and as media coverage began, it soon grasped the attention of the nation. But this wasn't the only murder spree. 4 miles or 6.5 kilometers away, Edward and Marguerite Vogenberger of Middletown, Pennsylvania, were found shot to death after being tortured with a newfangled taser, which most people had never heard of before. And fear escalated, with people wondering if there was some Charles Manson-like cult out there murdering people randomly. Well, unlike the Abt house, which had gone completely dark, the Ed and Marguerite Vogenbergers had lights on in every room, a distinct anomaly for them, as they were frugal, keeping one light on at a time. This change in their behavior did not go unnoticed by the neighbors, who commented about this amongst themselves. On Saturday, March 13th, a state trooper conducted a drive-by of the farm, which sold various products including corn and tomatoes and beans. But the trooper observed nothing unusual. However, on Sunday, when no one had seen Ed or Marguerite, Middletown Township Detective Donald Mather drove down the Vogenbergers' farm driveway, crossing over the traffic hose that Ed used to alert him when a customer arrived. Ringing the driveway alarm did not alert the Vogenbergers. Mather, who had known the couple since childhood, noticed that the back door was open, which was odd considering that the temperature was only in the 40s, or 4 degrees Celsius. After ringing the doorbell with no response, he peered through a window, and he saw Marguerite in her rocking chair, fully clothed, with an open book on her lap, and he thought she was sleeping. Ed was lying on the sofa, dressed in a gray work shirt and brown pants. But then Mather noticed the blood. Upon entering, he saw that Marguerite had bled from her nose, staining her kitchen apron all the way to her waist. Oddly, a wire of some sort was protruding from her stomach, while another loose wire dangled from her leg. Ed lay face down, with 2 holes in the back of his shirt. His pants had ridden up, exposing his socks. Police would learn that the thin wires and holes were caused by agonizing jolts with a taser, a new invention, an electronic stun gun. Quote, "Tasers fire electric shots capable of immobilizing even a young, healthy individual. One dart can disrupt the nervous system for about 15 minutes. And once a dart hits the victims, more shocks can be inflicted through the thin wire that connects the dart to the gun. The killer hadn't bothered to remove his wires from Marguerite's body. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing was actually there," end quote, Mather told Kathryn Canavan. This was ridiculous, this horror unfolding in a typical cozy 1970s living room. The room was filled with earth-tone colored furniture adorned with crocheted doilies. A Sears catalog, telephone book, and discarded Courier Times newspapers were neatly folded, highlighting the TV schedule for the big shows of the day, The Waltons and Welcome Back, Kotter. The invader or invaders used a taser to try to extract information about the Vogenbergs' hidden money or jewelry. When the couple refused to cooperate, their home was extensively searched. Before leaving, Marguerite was shot in the back of the head and Ed twice in the temple. The police were uncertain if this was out of frustration or to prevent identification because they would be witnesses. And the taser was so new, Middletown Chief Shook had to sit down with reporter Bill Newell and explain what it was and how it worked. Newell wanted to know if this was like a cattle prod, and he said, no, it looked like an electronic gun that shoots darts. Well, NASA engineer Jack Cover invented the taser after inadvertently walking into an electrified fence and being temporarily stunned. His intention was to create a non-lethal weapon that federal air marshals could use against hijackers. Well, kind of fun fact, the 1970s was known as the golden age of hijackings. From 1968 to 1972, over 300 airplanes were hijacked by various terrorist groups from the Middle East, Germany, and Japan, among others, who seized control of aircraft, made demands, and created a significant international threat. Now, 5 years earlier, in 1971, the infamous D.B. Cooper became one of the most famous and perplexing figures in aviation history when he hijacked Northwest Orient Flight 305. He demanded and received a ransom of $200,000 in Seattle, which in 2026 is about $1,650,000, and then successfully parachuted out of the plane over the Pacific Northwest and disappeared without a trace. And this mystery endures to this day. This incident marked a turning point for aviation security, prompting the establishment of the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA. The numerous threats to aircraft safety necessitated a major overhaul in security measures, and in response, governments and airlines permitted strict baggage screenings, deployed armed sky marshals, and installed metal detectors. Yes, for the first time, right? Metal detectors. You think they've been there forever. Well, these changes culminated in the passage of stringent legislation, such as the U.S. Anti-Hijacking Act of 1974. And security measures would tighten even further following the September 11th attacks in 2001. We're coming up on the 25th anniversary. Time, man, it flies. Well, back to the taser. So Jack Cover began selling his new deterrent device, and he initially sold about 3,500 units, with 100 going to police departments. Criminals quickly recognized how useful this weapon could be, and it reminds me of the saying, the best laid plans of mice and men oft go awry, originally from the poet Robert Burns in 1785, and later immortalized in John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. And it also brings to mind Alfred Nobel, who created nitroglycerin as a deterrent to war, because no one would want to go to war facing nitroglycerin, so it wouldn't happen. No, didn't work that way. Well, a friend of Marguerite and Ed's for almost 4 decades, James Hudson described them as plain good folks, old-fashioned, who kept to themselves. They worked all summer and then snowbirded down to Florida or California in the winter, and they never let anyone know when they were departing. These 2 horrific crime scenes, the Abt house and the Vogenberger house, were only an 8-minute drive apart, one in Trevose, the other in Langhorne in Middletown Township, where the Vogenberger case would be investigated. The proximity of these murders left the community uneasy. A murder in charming Langhorne would be shocking, but 2 multiple homicides in such close proximity, that heightened the anxiety among the detectives as well. Reporters thrived on the growing headlines despite their own feelings of unease. So murder bookies, what do you think? Are these cases connected? Is there one perpetrator running amok in southeastern Pennsylvania killing people? Is someone deliberately shaking up their MO to throw the detectives off? Let me know your theories. You can reach me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or find me on social media. Oh, and I just joined TikTok, so make sure you follow me there. Kathryn Canavan writes that, quote, reporters have beats like waitresses have tables. We are on the hook to serve up any news that happens on our beats, but we are also on guard against pushy reporters who try to poach good stories from our beats. Beats were sort of suspended that March. There was an all-hands-on-deck state of mind, end quote. But this had jolted everyone, even reporters. 8 people were dead, and the killer or killers were out there. Well, the weekend ended and the autopsies for the Abts were completed, and the medical examiner, Dr. Fillinger, was now set to examine the Vogenbergers. Ed and Marguerite were murdered that same Friday, March 12th, in the afternoon or early evening, just like the Abts. It was a true weekend horror, as the Courtier Times reported. With rumors inevitably circling, one claimed that a taser had been found at the Abt house, with both Michael Abt and the police denying. Police officers conducted searches at 11 stores across 3 states in search of the taser that had tortured the Vogenbergers. Detective Mather led the investigation and suspected that a distant cousin of Marguerite's was involved. Francis Gator Tomlinson was a troubled youth who had asked his Vogenberger cousins for a job, but this did not go well. Ed ultimately ran him off the property, as reported by their neighbor, Thelma Hudson. At 22 years old, Tomlinson was an unemployed handyman living in nearby Bristol. He had committed a heinous crime by raping a widow named Lucy Husvar, bludgeoning her to death and then setting her body on fire. Some suggested that Tomlinson might have been a pyromaniac. While awaiting trial, Tomlinson managed to escape from his Bucks County prison, walking past a rookie guard. But he was recaptured shortly thereafter. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison for the murder. In 1973, Tomlinson scaled a 13-foot or 4-meter wall at the state prison in Dallas, Pennsylvania, but was caught almost immediately and returned to custody. 2 years later, so in 1975, he escaped again, climbing a 30-foot or 9-meter wall at Montgomery County's Graterford prison. This time he was accompanied by a convicted armed robber, John Dickel, age 50. The 2 convicts remained on the run for the next 9 months, with Tomlinson being spotted in the Levittown area. One sighting occurred on March 11th, the day before the Vogenbergers were believed to have been murdered, which was why Tomlinson was now a suspect. He's on the run. He's going to need money. He had robbed the Vogenbergers before. He had killed before. Could he have returned to do it again? The only eyewitness, neighbor Arthur Krause, saw a dark-haired man leaving the farm early Sunday morning with a basket of clothing. But this seemed normal since the murdered couple often hired men to work their farm. However, 10 hours later, when the mobile crime van arrived, Arthur realized his assumption was wrong. Over 100 items from the farmhouse were sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C., but no fingerprints were found. The only clue was a boot print with a rippled sole found in the attic, which was the same size as the bloody print in the Abt basement. Huh. The mood in the IRS office in Philadelphia was somber as staff remembered Peggy Abt. A collection was taken for Clifford and Michael, and paperwork was filed for the $26,000, so think $152,000 today, from her life insurance, which was doubled due to her death by homicide. Michael and Clifford would also receive federal pension benefits. News trucks gathered on Fleetwood Avenue, where most of the residents had positive comments about the Abt family, though some found them nosy, particularly Peggy. Allegations surfaced that the boys bullied a neighbor's son to the point that she had chosen to drive him to school to avoid them. When the police brought Michael Abt to his house to collect clothes, his visit turned into an impromptu news conference. Dressed in faded jeans and a t-shirt, his blonde hair fell past his jaw. And Kathryn writes that she asked Michael a question, giving him the goosebumps. Quote, "What are you going to do? You're all alone now." Which sounds rude. I don't remember asking it, but it was 48 years ago. And Michael said it shook him because he'd heard it before in 1963. End quote. It was Easter when he was 10 years old, and the family was moving into their new home on Fleetwood Avenue. And someone asked the same question, and he never forgot it. But now he really felt truly alone. Kathryn now reflects on how she and her contemporaries, Michael and Clifford Abt, had grown up. They were all blue-collar, partly Irish-American families attending public school in the Pennsylvania suburbs. They enjoyed outdoor play in their neighborhood and in the woods, swinging on vines over streams, and tossing old television tubes off a cliff to hear them explode down below. In the winter, old car hoods became sleds, with several kids racing downhill, trying to avoid trees. Back when Michael and Cliff were in elementary school, they and the neighborhood kids often played the guys in the yard. So there's a vacation bungalow that was used occasionally on the weekends, and no one knew the owner's name, so he was simply called the guy. And when his car approached, the kids would scatter, alerted by shouts, "The guy is coming!" Now, looking back, this seems really silly, because right now, there is a real guy out there to be frightened of. While the police maintained a presence at the crime scenes, the entire community felt the impact of the murders, including the children. Newspaper girl Maria D'Ambrosio was met by police and escorted home after getting off her school bus. They wanted to ensure her safety in case the killer targeted her for possibly having caught a glimpse of him. The authorities were also very concerned about Michael Abt's safety. Was the killer still gunning for him? The number of interviews conducted were extensive due to the large number of victims and the acquaintances that each of them had. Peggy's co-worker, Kathleen Berman, noted she had never heard Peggy speak ill of anyone. Ken McDowell, who worked at Bell Telephone with Jack, described him as a talkative guy with a good sense of humor. George Geschwind, the neighbor who had the best view of the Abt home from across the street, was unemployed and spent all day at home, but reported that he didn't see or hear anything unusual. He had attended high school with Cliff. Felix Iostraco mentioned that his dog always barks at strangers, but it didn't bark that day. One boy told the police that he got off the school bus with Johnny and followed him right to the kitchen door on March 12th. And Heidi hadn't come running over that day, and there was some glass near the door. They stood there talking before he left and Johnny headed inside. He felt lucky to be alive. And in New Jersey, a man confessed to the murders, but claimed that the Abts didn't own a dog. Okay, so much for him. Then a call came in from a young woman who said the Abts were killed by a man she met in Fairless Hills, about 10 minutes from Trevose. She described him as singing strangely and breaking baby toys while claiming to be a follower of Charles Manson. When detectives visited the 19-year-old woman's apartment, she was puzzled. She didn't know the Abts, and it turns out she was estranged from her husband, who was likely pranking her. God, how sick is that? So many questions remained. The police received a lot of information when they inquired about Clifford. He supposedly liked to rip people off, had stolen a diamond engagement ring, and drove around in a Monte Carlo with his gun in his lap. Clifford and his friends, they used drugs in his bedroom, but his parents refused to acknowledge any of it. Another woman claimed that Clifford owed her $100 from a drug deal, but whenever she called, his parents would insist that he had moved out. And more and more and more stories like this were called in and repeated. Kathryn recounts a brief but significant interaction she had with Clifford. While she had visited the Abt house one night to see if there was any news, Clifford accidentally backed into her dark brown Toyota Corolla. Well, it was dark, and Clifford and fiancée Shelley apologized to her and offered to pay for the damage. And although Kathryn was not in a good financial position, she declined, feeling it was inappropriate to accept money from someone who had just suffered from such a terrible loss. And importantly, she realized that Cliff could have just said nothing, since so many vehicles were going up and down Fleetwood Avenue. He did not have to say that he had hit the car. Now, this investigation continued, and this is long before shoe manufacturing databases existed. To identify the source of the shoe print, investigators called various manufacturers, describing the sole print and eliminating potential shoes. They determined that the print from the Abt basement came from a shoe made by the Quaborg Rubber Company in Massachusetts. But their excitement faded when shift foreman Ken Fairbrother revealed that Quabag produced only soles, which were shipped nationwide. But determined, Detective Eckert checked every shoe at the Chamonix Mall and eventually identified a $32.99 boot at Sears that left the bloody impression. And the Sears was just 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers from the Abt house, the crime scene. Well, people also noted that it was fortunate that Cliff was in jail at the time, which saved him from being part of the slaughter. And his fiancée, Shelley, she had been too tired that night to drive to his parents' home, which kept her safe. And Michael, he had been busy helping with the wedding preparations of his best friend, so he wasn't home either that night. So they were all at the right place at the right time, unlike the rest of the family and poor Gary Engle. Now, Michael was frustrated as photographers snapped his picture. He didn't want his face in the newspapers while the person responsible for his family's massacre was still on the loose. And I don't blame him. Fearful of being a target, he found some relief from medication and alcohol. And his photos were still printed in the newspapers. Clifford was heartbroken in jail, and Shelley worried that he might have a nervous breakdown. Shelley's mother hired a former state senator as Clifford's attorney, and she lent him $699 for court costs, which would be roughly about $3,500 today. And Clifford would have avoided jail altogether if he had simply paid a fine for a forgery charge from 2 years earlier. But when the court discovered that he hadn't paid the fine, he was jailed for contempt on the Monday before his family's murder. Police initially thought that Clifford was safe in Bucks County Prison. However, his new attorney pointed out that a hired killer might have mistaken Gary Engle for an Abt, potentially leaving Clifford in danger. With safety in mind, Chief Michaels moved Clifford to a holding cell in Bensalem. Now, Cliff stood 6 feet tall, which is 1.8 meters or 72 inches, and he now faced a new cramped bunk which measured only 66 inches and no mattress. But Clifford didn't care. He was grateful for the protection, and the police brought Clifford pizza and McDonald's. But he also overheard people bad-mouthing him, accusing him of drug involvement, which was quite difficult on top of the devastating loss. Lying in bed, Clifford could only wonder who hated him enough to kill his family. No one came to mind. And while this was going on, the police were investigating the drug connection and into his fiancée Shelley's ex, a biker, but they found nothing significant. One lieutenant noted that this crime wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The killer had gone in there intending to kill. Chief Michaels told the media that the murders might be a professional hit or the work of a lone nut, and he was starting to get closer to the truth. And this being said, the family's funeral at St. Dominic's Catholic Church in Northeast Philadelphia was being planned, with the police providing security in case the killer returned. And they needed 30 pallbearers. 30 of them. At the 10 a.m. Mass, hundreds of mourners filled the church with many tissues in hand. 5 caskets, those of Jack, Peggy, Margie, Johnny, and Kathy, were wheeled down the aisle. Among the attendees were plainclothes detectives, while outside, 12 officers directed traffic. 12 pallbearers, middle school classmates of Kathy and Johnny, carefully carried the caskets on trolleys called biers. Michael noted that the tears from the kids only deepened his heartache. Decades later, he recalled the crushing sight. Quote, "Those poor little kids carrying their friends to their graves." End quote. More caskets and pallbearers made the journey to the sanctuary at the front of the church, the procession filling more than half the aisle. When Peggy's mother, Margaret Haney, arrived, emotionally fragile, she had to be supported by friends, her muffled sobs growing louder. Michael and Clifford, along with their fiancés, followed her. Reverend Richard Ferrand, Peggy's cousin, and the officiant at her marriage to Jack, conducted their burial today, joined by 5 other clergymen, including Reverend Lawrence Abt, Jack's brother. As incense was waved, symbolizing the soul's ascension to heaven, Kathy Abt's best friend, Carolyn Heitshoe, ran sobbing from the church. The hour-long ceremony was marked by tolling bells as dark skies threatened to rain. This prompted urgency in getting the caskets back into the hearses. And the funeral home, John Fleur and Sons, had to rent extra hearses because whoever needs that many? At the graves, women wore Jackie Kennedy-style pillbox hats and old-fashioned black lace mantillas, which covered their heads, falling to their shoulders. Quote, "The crowd turned as one and watched in silence while the first hearse climbed over the horizon and clambered down the narrow cemetery road towards them. Then the second hearse rose over the horizon. Then another, and another, and another. It was a dismal sight. The monstrous loss sank in as hundreds of eyes darted from hearse to hearse." End quote. Mourners huddled together as snowflakes fell, and a priest began his prayers, committing the family to earth, while tears filled Clifford and Michael's eyes. Grandmother now approached Clifford, telling him, quote, "Please, make a man of yourself for my sake." End quote. As the crowd slowly began to drift off, Michael thanked those near for attending. Children from the Neil Armstrong Middle School passed by, placing green and white carnations on their friends' caskets. This St. Patrick's Day felt somber, with sobs echoing from the children. Some parents were reluctant to let their kids attend, fearing that a killer was still out there. And after the service, Clifford was returned to his holding cell at the Bensalem Police Department. Gary Engle's aunt and uncle arranged for a private funeral at Sunset Memorial Park in the suburbs, and he was buried alongside his grandparents who had loved and raised him, and their shared cemetery marker was inscribed with the words, "Together forever." The following day, Edward and Marguerite Vogenberger were laid to rest at the Quaker Middletown Friends Meeting Cemetery, which dates back to the 1700s. The police were still uncertain about whether anything had been stolen from the Vogenberger farmhouse. They did find a large bag filled with coins valued at hundreds of dollars. Chief Michaels would tell a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter that, quote, "We have no new leads. Alls I can say is that even my mother is still a suspect." End quote. As the chief spoke, Lieutenant Zajac left, following a hunch, and before the week was out, he and his detectives would crack the case. Michael and Clifford were angry. Who could have done this? After his release from jail, Clifford stayed at the family home on and off, after physically clashing with Michael. Stunned and humiliated, Clifford learned that Michael was investigating his friends, searching for the family's killer. And Clifford hadn't ruled Michael out as a suspect either. Shocked, grieving, angry, with tension between them, everyone remained under suspicion. Michael was experiencing cold sweats that woke him up in the middle of the night, plagued by terrible dreams in which a killer sprang at him from nowhere. Using prescriptions and whiskey as coping mechanisms, he tried to navigate his new reality. But onlookers stared and cars passed in front of the house. If the Abt brothers were outside, people pointed. Research into the psychology of those who lose a loved one to violence did not exist in 1976. Today, we understand that losing a family member to a violent death is often more stressful for the family than those who survive the violent incidents themselves. Those affected are often labeled as being part of a, quote, homicide family, end quote, a sociological designation. Survivors of familial homicides are often referred to as co-victims of familicide or mass violence, and they experience profound psychological, sociological, and economic trauma. This loss is sudden, violent, with surviving family abruptly denied their natural family support system. Thus, community networks are needed for specialized interventions if long-term healing is going to begin. Co-victims have to immediately cope with a restructuring of family roles. Then there's funeral arrangements, real estate distribution, and the unwanted immediate attention while they're still in shock, which we certainly see happening with Michael. Beliefs can change, emotions may be numbed, and grief can be intense while others feel stigmatized, as we see with Clifford. Many experience fear for their own safety, which we see with both of them. They may also suffer from survivor's guilt, feeling as if they are somehow responsible for the demise of their loved ones. And this can lead to vivid recollections or visualizations of what the violent deaths looked like, or seeing over and over in your mind 5 caskets lined up in the church aisle. There may also be suspicions that other relatives were involved, which we also see happening with Michael and Clifford. An obsession with revenge is also common, and special occasions, such as birthdays, 6 in this case, and all the holidays, are particularly challenging because they occur every year unendingly. And the anniversary of the tragedy often brings out reporters, journalists, the police, podcasters, attorneys, making the experience even more difficult. All of this can contribute to issues such as alcohol and drug abuse, as well as high rates of divorce. And moreover, these studies have primarily examined the loss of a single family member, not the impact of losing multiple family members. So it's even worse. And the fear that the killer may return to finish the job is very real for these survivors. They are at risk for developing post-traumatic stress disorder, severe anxiety, and a prolonged, complicated grief. Now, Michael and Clifford generated a lot of negative gossip when they moved back into the Abt house. Well, how could they possibly live there where their family was slaughtered, people wondered. But they remembered the happier times, years of that, family holidays and dinners. With Clifford unemployed and Michael laid off for the winter, they really had few options. Now, this just absolutely devastated me. Crime scene cleanup companies, they didn't exist in the 1970s. The cleanup fell to the surviving family. Oof. And the basement floor was porous concrete, and the 6 pools of blood resisted their attempts to be cleaned. Joan Tomlinson, who was 21 and a friend, discovered that applying water to the dried bloodstains made them turn bright red again. So this is just horrendous. And Michael and Clifford's lives, they are in turmoil. Their grief is raw, their sense of loss palatable. Michael would say, quote, I don't care how bad I got. They, meaning his parents, always understood me. What happened to them stopped me dead in my tracks. I was destroyed. I couldn't feel love or hate. Just mad. It just killed me emotionally." End quote. Friends tried to help by hanging out and drinking some Pabst beer sitting around the teak table that Michael and his dad had made. And young women, they sought out Michael as if he was a member of Queen, whose big hit Bohemian Rhapsody was dominating the airwaves, with lyrics that were eerily similar to what happened in Trevose that March. Kathryn now explains how Jack Abt largely built his house on Fleetwood Ave himself, which was fairly common during that time. Growing up in the post-World War II era, people were industrious and motivated to create a good life, literally starting from the ground up. And this serves as a gentle reminder of what life was like 50 years ago, when neighbors brought food to each other during times of illness and came together to help an unemployed friend find work. They also handled disputes themselves, as demonstrated when Jack confronted an obnoxious kid who had crossed the line without any parents knocking on Jack's door to complain. Kind of miss this. Not the punching of people who do something you don't like, but the accountability and the responsibility of the times. And ironically, after the Vogenbergers murders, the interest in the Abt murders grew. As a result, Kathryn visited the Abt house daily. She knew she couldn't count on the police chief updating her. Now, the tension between her and the police chief stemmed back a year earlier when Ben Salem Township's first police officer, Patrolman Jimmy Armstrong, was killed by a small-time robber named Joe Hennessy. This incident sparked a 5-state manhunt, dominating the news in Philadelphia for almost a month. The chief first noticed Kathryn Canavan when she visited Hennessy's girlfriend, Sheila Carr, wanting to interview Sheila about how her life had changed now that her boyfriend was subject to a manhunt. What Kathryn didn't realize was that Sheila was already on the run with Hennessy, which, in my opinion, is a foolish decision. Don't make his crime your own. So when Kathryn arrived at Sheila's apartment, she knocked and suddenly found herself facing 2 men with guns pointed at her. Alarmed, quickly assessing her options, whether to freeze or run back down the hallway, one of the men finally said that they were Ben Salem police. A huge sigh of relief all the way around. They had been staking out the apartment, anticipating an armed fugitive, not reporter. While shaking, they let Kathryn go. And there is a lot more to this story, and I encourage you to read the book, because I just can't tell you everything. I would need 10 episodes. This is truly true crime at its finest, and it has the feel of a crime movie, dangerous adventure, which results in a significant miscommunication that puts Kathryn squarely at odds with Chief Michaels. The twists and turns in this story are just unbelievable. So I won't leave you hanging. Hennessy is finally caught, and during the murder trial, which takes place, Kathryn recalls seeing Hennessy's wife and girlfriend Sheila chatting amicably in the hallway outside the courtroom. Well, how absolutely open-minded of them. But how this all goes down, you really have to read the book. It's unbelievable. So, Lieutenant Ted Zajac. He resembles a 1970s TV detective with aviator glasses and 3-piece suits. In high school, he actually worked police dispatch, and then he joined the Navy, and getting out, joined the Ben Salem Police Department as an officer in 1961. And his wife, Pat, she would describe Ted's instinct for identifying untrustworthy individuals, which definitely would come in handy when you're a detective. And while investigating, Ted now felt something was off about the Abt neighbor, George Geschwind. Lieutenant Zajac would start his day by briefing his detectives on case developments. And this reminded me of the character, Sergeant Phil Esterhouse, from Hill Street Blues, portrayed by the late great talented Michael Conrad, whose catchphrase on the show was, "Let's be careful out there." Zajac would assign tasks based on leads, keeping township, county, and possibly state troopers informed of new developments. Deeply committed to solving this slaughter, many investigators were focused on Clifford Abt's acquaintances, while Zajac skipped out on the press conferences altogether and often forgot to have lunch. Of Ted Zajac, Detective Eggert would say, quote, "The guy would take any call. He worked hard. He would go over things many times to make sure they were done correctly." End quote. Zajac believed that individuals who break the law in one area are likely to break the law in others. Thus, he assigned an officer to sift through the large file of stolen gun reports, hoping it might lead to the killer. This search uncovered 15 residents, 2 women and 13 men, one of whom was George Geschwind. George reported his .22 caliber Sturm Ruger pistol stolen at 2:30 p.m. on March 5th, just 90 minutes after he purchased it. Well, this seems suspicious. Additionally, the Abts had been shot with a .22 caliber pistol, capable of firing powerful hollow point bullets, which matched the specifications of Geschwind's Sturm Ruger. Moreover, George Geschwind lived directly across the street from the Abts. The Geschwind house was one of the first places Detective Eckert visited the night of the murders, as it offered the best view of the crime scene. He spoke with Geschwind's mother and stepfather, but neither had much to say. Only at the end of this conversation did they mention that the son lived there, and George emerged from the front bedroom, which had the best view of the Abt house. He was very thin and wearing a white t-shirt and pants, and he struck Eckert as being a bit odd. Quote, "When you're doing these neighborhood interviews, people are usually asking the cops a lot of questions about what happened, but I don't remember him being very inquisitive. After you do enough of these interviews, the strange things like that kind of pop out at you. He just didn't ask a lot of questions." End quote. So Sergeant William Johnson had taken the report about the stolen gun from 24-year-old George. George had left his brand new pistol in the saddlebag of his Honda motorcycle while he went to check out the movie theater and visit the Spaceport arcade. He had only been gone about 10 minutes, and when he returned to his bike, the gun was missing. Johnson said, quote, "Only an idiot would leave a gun in a saddlebag of a motorcycle when he went shopping at the mall." End quote. And wait, he was there for 10 minutes? Who goes and plays games at an arcade for less than 10 minutes? Okay, that is really weird. And suspicions, as it would turn out, were warranted because George's gun was actually hidden at his mother's house. He believed that the report of the gun being stolen was a preemptive move, as it would reasonably cover him if the police began looking through gun records. However, this was George Geschwind's undoing. Now Zajac shared his thinking with Chief Michaels, who was baffled as to why a shy, polite college grad who didn't smoke or do drugs would suddenly kill his neighbors. 6 times this skinny guy got the jump on the Abts. To the chief, it seemed like a stretch, and he just didn't believe that anyone acquainted with the Abts would harm their dog. But Zajac was not deterred. Something was off about this guy, his intuition pinging. And in the investigation, while half of the detectives were examining Clifford's drug connections, the other half were now investigating George Geschwind. A few hours after the Abt funeral on March 17th, 2 detectives picked up George Geschwind and went to administer a polygraph test. When they noticed he was dressed up, they asked if he had attended the funeral. No, he had not. He had been out job hunting. At the police station, Zajac waited for him. Following the 1964 Miranda decision, conducting police interviews had shifted, becoming more respectful of suspects' rights. And Zajac embraced this approach, aiming to make suspects feel comfortable during the process. This is a really critical part of this investigation, the polygraph, which is not usually admitted in court. But they are very useful and often give the police an idea if they are going in the right direction regarding this suspect. George agreed to take a polygraph, and he was connected to the machine, and the questions began. Was he off his property at any time on Friday? Did he resent taking a polygraph? Was his gun actually stolen? As the needle reacted. When asked if he recognized the .22 caliber Sturm Ruger, George said that his gun had a different pattern on it. Well, he'd only had it in his possession for 90 minutes, and most of that time it was in the saddlebag. So how was he sure that it had a different pattern? And he had reported it stolen 9 days earlier. So this didn't sit well with the officers either. The needle moved again when the polygrapher mentioned that 2 victims had rags stuffed into their mouths, information only the police, Dr. Fillinger, and the killer were aware of. However, the most crucial question, quote, regarding the incident Friday night at the Abt house, are you yourself responsible for that? End quote, which failed to move the needle at all. Zajac and Eckert were disappointed with the polygraph results. The connection between Geschwind and the crime was weak, with no fingerprints or definitive evidence, and they feared the case would go cold until George Geschwind made a mistake. Now, to explain what happened, I have invited polygraph expert Jennifer Thompson to join me. She has an extensive background in criminology and investigations. She was also an intern with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. She's a member of the Vidocq Society that delves into cold cases, and I'll let Jennifer tell you more about herself right now. So let me welcome her to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. Introduce yourself.
Okay. I am Jen Thompson. I am a polygraph examiner located in Severna Park, Maryland. I am federally certified. I worked for the National Security Agency for 6 years doing polygraphs and tested over 1,000 folks within that time frame. My current practice specializes in infidelity cases, pre-employment, corporate compliance, criminal investigations, also post-conviction sex offender testing. As a standard of being paroled, many offenders need to be polygraphed periodically to ensure that they are not reoffending, and I've been trained in how to do that. So that's what I'm doing currently.
That is amazing. I had no idea you were doing all of that.
Yeah.
That's just awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and answering some questions we have about George Geschwind's polygraph.
Yes.
I don't have the transcript because that has not been digitalized, but we know he moved the needle when he was asked if his gun was really stolen. And then when they talked about 2 victims having rags stuffed in their mouths, it moved then. But then I came to this part where they came to like the critical question. And it was regarding the incident Friday night at the Abt house. Are you yourself responsible for that? And the needle didn't even budge. And then they later realized the question was wrong or something. Could you explain why this question was wrong and didn't elicit the response the police were looking for?
Sure. That question is awfully broad. Are you yourself responsible for that? It leaves room for interpretation. For example, someone could determine in their own mind, well, I was only partially responsible. Was I legally responsible? No, I wasn't morally responsible. They can sort of wiggle their way out of it mentally. So you have to be really, really specific. So a better question might have been, for example, did you commit the shootings that occurred on Friday night in the Abt residence? That would have
see
been
that.
more on point. Even to say, did you commit the incident that occurred? Incident is too broad. You have to really narrow it down to the actual specific action that you believe that person took.
So did you shoot and kill the people in the house?
I would just say, did you shoot the people in the house?
Oh yeah, I see what, this is why you're the polygrapher and I am
Well,
not.
because kill, he might wiggle his way out of that mentally and say, well, I don't know if I killed them. Maybe I just shot them, So you have to say, just be specific. It needs to be one specific issue. It can't be two different things like shoot and kill. It needs to be one issue within each question, just to keep the person from wiggling out of it in their own mental capacity.
Well, it seems so obvious now, but I was baffled. It just didn't make sense to me. Well, there you are. Well, thank you. It's now obvious to everybody because now we all understand. Okay. Well, Jen, hey, listen, before I let you go, if somebody needs a polygrapher, how do they get in touch with you?
You could contact Jennifer at mendexforensics.com. And that's M as in Mary, E as in Edward, N as in Nancy, D as in dog, A as in Apple, X, common spelling for forensics. So that's Jennifer at mendexforensics.com. You could also visit that website, mendexforensics.com, where you can schedule a test. But you can also just reach out to me at that email if you have any questions at all.
Absolutely perfect. Well, thank you so much for clarifying that for me. I really appreciate it.
Sure, I'm glad. I'm happy to.
Well, to continue with the story, while fishing in Neshaminy Creek, two boys, Adam Laster and Michael Scher, discovered a .22 caliber pistol, which Michael Scher pulled from the mud and unloaded. It was a Sturm Ruger with 6 hollow point bullets. Returning home, Michael Scher showed the gun to his stepfather, who then turned it into the Lower Southampton Police Department, which shares a border with Bensalem. Now, in 1976, there's no computerized system, so this information did not reach the Bensalem Police Department. But a fortunate break occurred when a Bensalem police officer and a Lower Southampton police officer just happened to stop by the Trevose firehouse for a cup of coffee at the same time and started chatting. During their conversation, the Southampton officer mentioned that a kid had found a gun under a bridge, and it went from there. And upon checking the serial number of the gun, they discovered it matched that of George Geschwind. He had pulled off an 11-hour murder spree and tripped himself up by throwing the gun too shallow off the bridge. Now, this is not all that unusual, right? And Kathryn Canavan highlights several notable criminals who are apprehended due to stupid mistakes. All right, for example, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. He was caught after receiving a parking ticket near one of the murder scenes. Similarly, after the Chi Omega murders and the murder of Kimberly Leach in Florida, Ted Bundy was arrested for a traffic violation. And just like that, the Abt investigation was red hot. Now officers recovered 7 spent .22 Magnum shell casings and a thin metal headband with ear protectors. Dave Cleese noted it was, quote, a miracle that the gun didn't land in deep water because they probably never would have found it, end quote. With the drug theory now dismissed, attention focused fully on George Geschwind, the Abt's neighbor. So, who is George Geschwind? He was born on September 7th, 1951, to Josephine and Fred Geschwind, and his childhood was far from pleasant. Fred was a brutal alcoholic who made life at home miserable for Josephine and their 4 children. There was an incident when Fred tried to run his children over with the car. He often cursed at Josephine, calling her derogatory names, including whore and Pollock bitch. His behavior was violent and erratic. There was no affection in their home. No one actually spoke to anybody else. Josephine was overwhelmed with anxiety and retreated into herself. She never attended PTA meetings or parent-teacher conferences, and the neighbors were completely unaware of the turmoil that occurred in the small White House. The Abts moved in when George was 12, and his life changed. Clifford and Michael were playful and extroverted, and George joined them for hikes, swimming in the creek, basketball games in the driveway. Then, in middle school, Clifford and George threw some rocks at what they thought was an abandoned house, only it was not, and one rock nearly hit a sleeping baby, leading the mother to complain to Mrs. Geschwind. Next, the boys dragged some rocks and lumber onto the train tracks. Fortunately, this was noticed before the train struck this, which would have caused a derailment. 4 boys were caught, including Clifford and George. And Mrs. Geschwind had to pay a fine of $212.50, which represented 25% of their family income, since Josephine supported the family cleaning hotel rooms. No more. Josephine cut off George's contact with these boys, these troublemakers, especially that Abt boy. And Michael, who was only 11 at the time, noticed that George suddenly disappeared. George became more introverted in high school without any close friends. His mother remarried, Tino Colon, known as Tino, but George and Tino barely connected, and they still rarely spoke in their house. A classmate of George recalled him being bullied on the school bus. And then, to make matters worse, George had an accident with a shearing machine, losing half of his middle finger and the tips of 2 others. Embarrassed, he often kept his hands in his lap, and George admitted that he spent his school years largely daydreaming, feeling like a shadow living across from 3 popular teens who were always having fun. With a slightly above IQ, Gesh, as he was known, graduated 170th out of 328 students. George joined the Navy after high school, but things didn't go well for him when he realized he suffered from motion sickness, so he would get seasick. He attempted to go AWOL, but his mother and stepfather persuaded him to turn himself in. Hoping to be released from his 6-year commitment, he falsely admitted to using illegal drugs, which allowed for him to get out of the Navy after 4 years. And this was a good decision. George used his veteran benefits to attend Bucks County Community College, where he got C grades, but he earned an associate's degree in business administration. Unfortunately, interviewing was not his strong suit. He struggled to find a job. He later enrolled in a truck driving school, but that did not work out either. And now he drifted from job to job, rarely succeeding at anything. After a summer landscaping job ended, he found himself relying on unemployment. And the Abts, they tormented him. November 1975. George found trash on his lawn. As he picked it up, he swore he heard the Abts inside laughing and watching him. Was this real or a hallucination? Fixating on them, he began to daydream about killing them. Quote, his ticking clock was already at 1:15 when he ran into Michael and his 2 friends in front of his house on Christmas morning in 1975. The young men wished him Merry Christmas, and his response fuddled them. It was like talking to a zombie, Michael said. All 3 of us just looked at each other, and then we all said the same thing. What the fuck is wrong with that guy? It didn't take a clinical psychiatrist to see there was something wrong. End quote. And while they saw that something was off, none recognized the malignant intentions harbored within George Geschwind. 2 months later, George entered Jay's Guns and Shooting Supply and purchased the .22 caliber Ruger. 90 minutes later, he walked into the Ben Salem police station, reporting that his gun had been stolen. Afterwards, he rode his motorcycle deep into the thick woods to practice shoot. And a week later, he shot his victims at point-blank range. He believed his plan was foolproof, or so he thought. March 22nd, 10 days after the murders, Detective Bob Epkert and Tom Garica-Catoli visited Fred Geschwind Jr., George's brother. Although Fred was not there, his boss confirmed Fred had been at work until 5:30 the day of the mass killing. At dinner time, Detectives Ed Kaiser and Norm Martin picked up George Geschwind, coordinating their activities with the district attorney's office. George agreed to go to the station again and to discuss his observations of that night, and he was promised a ride back home. At 8 p.m., he was sitting across from Lieutenant Zajac and expert polygraph examiner, Detective Dick Batesel. Defense attorney Richard Fink would explain, quote, "Defense attorneys call polygraph exams confession machines because when a suspect takes a polygraph and fails it, his will is broken. He may assume that the police have all the evidence they need to convict him." End quote. But George Geschwind wasn't a pushover. He was confident he hadn't left any fingerprints. And now he was confident he could beat the machine as he had done 5 days earlier. However, Zajac and Batesel knew who committed the crime. They just needed to understand why. And a signed confession, that would be a bonus. They handed George a Miranda warning form to sign, and he did. Did he want a lawyer to represent him? Well, George wanted to tell the truth, so he agreed to answer their questions. Hooked up to the machine, the officers now informed him that his gun had been found. And that revelation must have hit him hard. Did he know where they found it? Confidence shaken some, George replied, "No." "Did you fire one or more shots that resulted in the death of the people in the Abt house?" "No." Paraphrasing now. And the questions came quickly, in a known solution peak of tension format. The examiner asked 5 to 9 nearly identical yes or no questions to suss out what the suspect knows about the crime. One question includes something that only the guilty party and the police know. For example, if you threw or placed anything on the bodies, A, would that be a shovel? B, would that be a rake? C, would that be a broom? D, would that be a tire? E, would that be a bike? F, would that be a chair? G, would that be a ladder? When Basil said tire, the needle jumped so much the untrained eye could see it. Clearly, George Geschwind knew about a tire being placed on Gary, something only the killer would know. He was told he failed the polygraph test, and the investigators wanted to know why he killed the Abts. George tried to deflect, asking how the machine detects lies, but the officers did not bite. When he asked to see the evidence against him, they said he would have to wait for trial. The truth was, the only evidence they could use in court so far was the gun. Now George was asked, what would he say if they found a hair of his in the Abt house? Stammering, George suggested that maybe the hair had fallen on the gun, which had been stolen by the killer who went in the house, which was kind of ludicrous. After some back and forth, Basil finally asked the right question, hitting the button. Had someone from the Abt family done something to him to cause this? Geschwind said that admitting to something like this would be difficult. Quote, "I didn't want to hurt anybody, but they made me." End quote. Michael and his friends called him a jerk-off and a shithead. Johnny had shot BBs at his motorcycle. They made prank calls to his house. Heidi had pooped on his lawn, and when he mowed the lawn, he ran over rocks put there by the Abts. Someone sent flowers to his house, cash on delivery, and he knew it was the Abts. He could see them through the window, laughing at him. It was clear, quote, his hatred of the Abts had been bubbling up inside him for 4 long years, end quote. But was any of that real? Had George's fantasy life taken a malignant turn? He also complained about the backfires, the cars making those popping noises. Okay, that was real, because Jack had shown his kids how to do this, just joking around having some fun. It had nothing to do with George. George admitted that he was depressed and he couldn't find a job despite his degree in business administration. And then, last November, he began plotting to kill the Abt family. Earlier, he had actually contemplated killing his own family, but now he was obsessed with the Abts. Outside of the door, District Attorney Michael Kane was listening. As the confession continued, Kane typed up 6 complaints charging George Geschwind with 6 counts of murder, and by 11:30 p.m., Kane was on his way to the district justice's office. George detailed his meticulous planning. He chose the .22 caliber because it was cheaper than the .38. And while the hollow point Magnum cartridges were expensive, they were necessary because they'd incapacitate the target more. His ears protected, he had shot them up close in the face. And if he had stayed quiet and not admitted to this, he might have gotten away with it. He explained also that he had delayed the attack on the Abts for a few days because his mother was home ill. Once she returned to work on March 12th, he broke into the house, breaking the window. There, he waited for several hours for the first Abt to arrive, and he was disappointed that Clifford and Michael hadn't come home, especially since Michael was the one he wanted most. After the killings, he had taken off his glasses as a precaution to throw off anyone who might be a witness. And he didn't just walk across the street and go home. He circled the block, being stealthy. He'd hidden his gun and gloves in the garage, and then he'd made a tuna sandwich, eating it as Officer Cleese was discovering the mass shooting. The next morning, George's mother watched his blood-stained gray slacks. He added them to the Goodwill donation pile. That weekend, he had felt the need to get this off his chest, and he told his mother most of the truth, though not the whole story. He claimed he had been forced at gunpoint to go to the Abt house. Josephine didn't ask any questions, nor did she call the police. With his blood-spattered 9D-sized boots and other incriminating items in his saddlebag, he set off for Washington's Crossing State Park to toss them in the Delaware River, the same spot that George Washington made the historic crossing on Christmas Day in 1776. 3 days later, George drove to the bridge and threw his gun, ear protectors, and spent cartridges and live rounds into the creek. And at 11:45 p.m., George was arraigned with a search warrant that was signed and executed. At midnight, George was starving, and he downed a steak sandwich and drank some water. And at 12:30 a.m., Chief Michaels and DA Ken Vine announced the arrest to reporters. George also agreed to take a polygraph test regarding the murders of Ed and Marguerite Vogenberger, but he insisted that he was innocent. For his own safety, he was then moved to nearby Bristol Township, and Patrolman Bill Fox, who was in George Geschwind's graduating class, was baffled. Quote, "Here's a guy who looked like he won't hurt a fly. He's a very wimpy type person. You never know," end quote. And that is where I will pause our true crime book, episode 175, Let's Be Careful Out There, on Killer in the House by Kathryn Canavan, Part 2. I am sorry I had to leave things out, but I can't turn this into 10 episodes, and there is still so much more to come due to Kathryn Canavan's incredible research into this case that she was reporting on 50 years ago. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing. The conclusion, Part 3, will drop shortly, and we will see what the fate of George Geschwind is, as well as Michael and Clifford Abt, and what's happening with the Vogenberger case. My next Patreon Zoom, where we discuss true crime, trials, and which book will be featured next on my podcast, is August 6th, 2026 at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can support the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast by joining for $2 to $4 a month. So we're talking like $24 a year, and I will see you there. And it might feel early, but are you thinking about CrimeCon 2027 in Orlando? If so, use my code MurderShelf, one word, all lowercase letters, and save yourself 10% on your badge. I mean, why not? Never doubt that your input is invaluable. I cannot do this without you. So thank you for listening, Murder Bookies. Please take a moment to leave a positive review, which will help me attract new listeners. You can connect with me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com and find me on X, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Don't forget about TikTok. My sources, diagram of the Abt house, photographs, news articles, that is on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, July 2026. I see you as you hear me. This time he was accompanied. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.
Most of us are one good deal away from finally replacing that worn-out rug, fixing up the backyard, or getting the bedroom we actually want. Good news, that deal's almost here. Wayfair's Black Friday and July sale. Get up to 80% off area rugs and up to 60% off outdoor and bedroom furniture. Shop Wayfair's huge selection of styles and find the piece to fit your style, budget, and space. Plus, free shipping. Black Friday and July ends July 27th. Shop today at wayfair.com.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
When your daughter's learning how to drive and says,
But can I drive?
you say,
Híjole. Here we go.
but what you should say is something that helps protect your ride.
Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
And that's where State Farm comes in, to help you choose the coverage you need, so you can relax until you hear,
Can we pick up my boyfriend?
Wait, what?
like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. State Farm, Bloomington, Illinois.